This is probably a little different talk than any of us have given before, so we're just going to kind of present a little case study of chemical pollution, and then I'll sit up here at the end so we can have a longer chat. And so this was kind of an opportunity for us to kind of do a thought experiment that's a little outside of our normal research, but kind of touches on what we actually do. So we want to look at, how chemicals get into the environment, how they impact the environment, and can we better predict that? And we're going to take a very chemical perspective to that. Matt and I are certainly trained along the chemical side. Ron deals with chemicals all the time.
We'll do something different.
We're going to avoid things like microbiology and things like that. So there are often two opinions that are voiced about chemicals, right? First one is that chemicals are good, and this is true, right? There are massive economic benefits of chemicals. There are massive health benefits of chemicals. Modern life would not be possible without chemistry, as the American Chemistry Council will tell you, right? The chairs you're sitting on, the clothing you're wearing, all the electronic devices you're using, this all relies on chemistry. Electrical engineers may disagree about some of the electronics, but the other thing is that chemicals are bad, right? That they're toxic, that they're poisonous, that they damage the environment, right? That they're bad for you. And of course, there are real economic damages of chemicals, right? There are public health impacts of chemicals, right? So, a large number of deaths every year can be attributed to air pollution. There was a big study that came out of Columbia recently that looked at the costs of chemical pollution in Europe, and they're massive. And the question is, how much do those costs offset the benefits that we get? And we have to make policy decisions regarding those trade-offs. So, of course, the truth is somewhere in between. There are some chemicals that certainly go much more towards the good side, the benefits outweigh the costs, and there are chemicals that are definitely way towards the bad side. And we'll give some examples of each of them in here. So I'm going to talk about 3 different chemicals, but all kind of look the same. And so there's kind of a lesson to be learned, or maybe lessons we should have learned with these chemicals. So the first 2 are commonly known by their abbreviation. So PCBs are polychlorinated biphenyls. PBDEs are flame retardants. They're polybrominated diphenyl ethers. You're probably actually sitting on them right now. And then triclosan is something you may have used this morning if you put what's in all your consumer products. So PCBs are an old chemical. They were banned in 1979, but they're still a problem today. And part of that is they're extremely stable, right? And that's what made them so useful as chemicals. They don't catch on fire. They didn't break down. So you can put them in things like the ballast in fluorescent lights, and in transformers, and in cooling systems, right? And so they prevented fires in these systems, and they were really designed to be contained when they were used. So most of their release into the environment was either through negligence or accident or the like. They weren't supposed to be put out there. But what makes them such great chemicals in terms of electrical and chemical stability also makes them very bad environmentally. So the big piece here is this term called KOW. So this is an octanol water partition coefficient. Water is what surrounds a lot of us in the environment. Octanol is essentially a nice chemical substitute for fat. And so a big way to test where a chemical is going to go, or whether it's going to go into fish, is to measure its octanol water partition coefficient. And if this value is between 1 million and 10 million, or 1 million and 100 million, right? That means it's 1 million times more likely to find a molecule of it in the fish than in the water. Or if you have 1,000,001 molecules, you have 1 million in the fat of the fish and 1 molecule in the water. And so you would really you don't want this molecule in either one, but when you get that large KOW, you have something that's persistent and bioaccumulative. And so bioaccumulation is the process where you have very small amounts in the lower parts of the food chain. And then, of course, the little fish eat the plants, the bigger fish eat the little fish, and then you have higher chain species up here, food chain species eat these things, and they accumulate this chemical much beyond what they would be at equilibrium. So even though perhaps if all these species were in equilibrium with the environment, they would have similar concentrations in their fat. Not only is this walrus or seal, otter, whatever this guy is, getting the contamination from the environment, it's also getting it from its food. Right? So because these things prefer fat over water, they tend to bioaccumulate. So this was kind of an unanticipated product of PCBs. And the reason these were banned in the 70s, this all came from silent spray. Right? We had DDT that was killing the birds of prey, and we got the analytical instrumentation that allowed us to see these chemicals. And so we had this kind of structure. So these are some PCB congeners. There's like 200 something different PCBs depending on where you put all the chlorines and how many chlorines you have. We kind of knew that chlorinated aromatic compounds might cause us some difficulty at this point. So about this time, we had there was a question about whether fires in furniture were caused because people were falling asleep on the couch with a cigarette in their mouth, or whether the couch was too flammable. And particularly in California, they decided the couch was too flammable. And so the way to do that is you put a flame retardant into your material. And so this is the polybrominated diphenyl ethers. And so they're in, not as much anymore, but they're in polyurethane foams and electronics. California at some point had a rule where you had to be able to cigarette lighter up to your laptop and it couldn't catch on fire for a certain amount of time. Christmas trees was another one. And the way to do that is you put these polybrominated diphenyl ethers in there. Now, the only way these things work is if they're not bound to the material, because when the heat forms, they have to release, and the bromine basically has to come off of them and quench the fire. So whereas the PCBs were industrial chemicals, really supposed to be contained, these ones we know are going to leak out. That structure looks a lot like a PCB. So, in the 90s, we started to find PBDEs out in the environment, right? They were dubbed the new PCBs, which really isn't a fair characterization of them because these were consumer chemicals, so we kind of found them in different places than we did with PCBs. And our exposure to them, both the environmental exposure and the human exposure, is different. Your major exposure from PBDEs isn't from eating fish or things like that, it's from sitting on your furniture or your house desk. Right? And so, just about the time PCBs were being banned, these started to be produced. So this is one of those things where perhaps we had thought about it a bit more and looked at the structure, we thought, maybe we should make these things. And then production peaked in the 90s, and this is about the time the environmental chemists got good enough to see them. So the concentrations rose, and also new analytical techniques came around. And so much like PCBs, they bioaccumulate, they persist in the environment, there's long-term transport, and pretty quickly there was a call to phase these things out. And so most of them got phased out started in 2009, and some of this was legislatively driven, and some of this was actually market driven. So for example, Walmart at some point said, we're not going to carry products that have certain flame retardants in them anymore. And if Walmart won't carry your product, you've got to reformulate it. So the third example I'm going to give before I turn this over to Matt is more local. So this is the compound triclosan. So this is my own research I did. We've been studying this compound in my lab for about, as long as I've been at the University of Minnesota now, so about 15 years. So if you used antibacterial hand soap this morning, you washed your hands with triclosan. And you expose yourself to it because it diffuses through your skin when you do so. But it's in toothpaste, footwear, acne creams, microban plastics. So this was introduced in about the 1960s when it was patented. It was in 1964. And really kind of during the antimicrobial craze in the 80s and 90s, when we started to get scared of diseases and media became more, talk about HIV and talk about SARS and talk about something else. People think they've got to kill all the germs. So its use really increased rapidly in the 80s and 90s. It's actually decreasing now. I always have to point out here, this slide isn't perfect. The toys actually do not contain triclosan, although there was talk of putting triclosan into the plastic in toys so when little kids chewed on them, bacteria wouldn't grow in them. So what we did is we were interested in what happens to these things in natural systems. Various people figured out, including USGS, that we use this stuff, we wash it down the drain, and the thought was, okay, the wastewater treatment plant will remove it all. Well, it turns out the wastewater treatment plant removes about 90% of it, and we use a lot of it. And so it gets out into the environment from the wastewater. So now here's a third different pathway that chemicals get out in the environment. 3 chemicals of similar structure. One kind of, rubs off in house dust. One from industrial sources. One through your water. And we got curious as to how much of this stuff persisted in the environment. So here's triclosan and some derivatives where they accumulate in sediments. Turns out when triclosan is exposed to sunlight, it cyclizes and forms dioxins. and dioxins were this classic compound that we banned in the 70s as well. We never made them purposefully, but we made them accidentally. These are unknown toxic class of chemicals, so we were curious as to what happened there as well. So we went to Lake Pepin, and we took sediment cores. And when you slice up the sediment core, the deeper you go, the further back in time you go. And so we took about 2 meter long sediment cores. It turns out if you go to the bottom of a 2 meter long core, you're at about 1850. And you can use lead isotopes to date those sediment cores. And so here's triclosan, here's the year. This is the triclosan concentration in nanograms per gram. So you see nothing until about 1960, which makes sense. Triclosan wasn't invented until then. And then you see it rise as consumer use increased. And it increases about 10 nanograms per gram. It turns out during the wastewater treatment process, you can alter the triclosan, make something called chlorinated triclosan derivatives. We can see those, same pattern. So here's the dioxin that comes from triclosan. It's 2,8-dichlorobenzoldioxin. This comes up, doesn't exist before triclosan, and then it rises. These are 3 other dioxins we can link to triclosan. So depending on which lake we look at, the dioxin load varies. So Lake Winona up by Alexandria is like 60% of the dioxin mass in the lake comes from triclosan. Whereas in Lake Pepin, it's more like 10 or 15%. Now, mass and toxicity are different things. Right? So these aren't the most toxic dioxins. Again, there's 209 different dioxins. But still, these are chemicals that probably aren't supposed to be there. It's a chemical we're using by choice. It's not like, medicine that's absolutely necessary for your health. It's accumulating in the environment. So this project was funded by the state of Minnesota and the National Science Foundation. We gave the report back to the legislature, and the legislators then ran with it with some help from Mike Osterholm, talking about the public health issues. And in the last legislative session, just about a year ago, the Minnesota legislature banned consumer use of triclosan starting January 1st, 2017. Unless the FDA approves it for use in consumer products. Now there's a fascinating point right there, right? So triclosan has one approved consumer use, and it's in anti-gingivitis toothpaste. All the other uses of triclosan, soap, hand washes, body creams, dish soaps, it's operating under a temporary license issued in 1974. FDA has never done their formal review. So the National Resources Defense Council is sued, and that ruling is supposed to come in 2015. And the manufacturers are going to have to show that it is effective and safe for long-term use in order for it to be approved. And so it's been 40 years, 41 years. We'll see if FDA finally does it. But here were 3 different chemicals, all of similar structure, kind of introduced. One was introduced and then banned, and then 2 others introduced later that had similar structures that perhaps we should have looked at those structures and said, we really need to know where these things are going in the environment before we put them on the market. With that, I'd like to let Matt present the next case study here.
Okay, thanks, Bill. So what Bill just described is sort of the evolution of environmental chemistry as we know it. And so basically, PCBs were our guinea pigs, if you will, of how chemicals move through the environment. I always tell people I'm an environmental chemist. I study processes. I don't study chemicals. Having said that, looking at PBDEs, you'd think, okay, maybe we should make these triclosan, maybe not such a great idea. Now I'm going to talk to you about a chemical that I call the Sesame Street of chemicals. One of these kids is not like the other. This has sort of turned everything we know about environmental chemistry on its ear because it behaves completely differently. And it is a class of chemicals called perfluorochemicals. And as I mentioned, we have environmental chemistry, and these are, POP is persistent organic pollutant. What Bill told you could also be classified as what we call hydrophobic organic contaminants, another subclass of POPs. But essentially you have some source of your POP, and it can react in the atmosphere to something else. You can have gas phase pollutants, particle phase pollutants, which is there's an equilibrium there. The particle phase can fall out into lakes and soils and plants. The gas phase can be taken up by, or exchanged between the air and the water, and between the soil and the plants and the air. If it exists in the groundwater, it can get into your aquatic system. Then once it's in the aquatic system, the particles can settle to the sediments. They can be resuspended from the sediments, and or the dissolved phase. It can get up into the food chain that Bill showed you. And so what we're worried about are molecules that tend to cycle all through the environment. So when you look at the class of chemicals, I'm going to talk about perfluorochemicals, they tend to not do this kind of thing. So what these chemicals will do, not only with what Bill showed you with going through a wastewater treatment plant into Lake Pepin and things like this, these molecules will do this throughout the entire globe. Something we call global distillation, or the grasshopper effect. So generally, these molecules are produced in the temperate mid-hemisphere of the Earth, particularly the northern hemisphere, where it's warm, they volatilize, they go to parts that are cooler, they condense out. That's global distillation. Oops, what happened? What did I do?
You didn't.
I didn't do it?
No.
Are you sure I didn't do it?
Yeah.
Oh, there we go, I'm back. Magic, I hit the button, I hit the right button there. Okay, so it evaporates from warmer climates, condenses in cooler climates, and that can take one big jump, or it can do what we call the grasshopper effect. Volatilizes, condenses. Basically, it spreads out from the warmer climates and ends up in the colder climates, okay? This causes global ubiquity of these molecules. You can find PCBs and PBDEs in the Arctic. Okay, you can find them in polar bear fat, you can find them in beluga whales, you can find them everywhere. Inuit blood, they're there, okay? Once they get there, as Bill pointed out, they like fat, so they go into, they're what we call lipophilic. They go to the fat part of organisms. Perfluorochemicals, oh, I'm sorry, let me step back. So Frank Vanya at University of Toronto, I think he's at Toronto, I can't remember where Frank is, came up with this really neat way of predicting if you have a molecule. So since we've learned all this stuff about PCBs and PBDs, why don't we apply this to other molecules? If we know something about the physical chemical parameters of the molecule, we can determine how far in the globe it can be transported. And so what he has here is on the y-axis here is the air-water partition coefficient, the Henry's law. So will it want to partition at the gas phase or stay in the dissolve phase? Here, on this x-axis, the octanol air partition coefficient, so it would rather be an air or an octanol. It's like partitioning from the gas phase to plant waxes. Or this KOW that Bill told you about already, octanol water partition coefficient. If it's in an aquatic system, is it going to want to stay in the dissolve phase, or is it going to want to go into the fat of an organism? So if you look, the higher the KOW, and there's nothing really higher than 10, the higher the KOW, the higher the KOA, the lower the air-water exchange coefficient, the Henry's law constant, basically the more it's going to stay in your soil and sediment and not go very far. It's not very volatile. It's not going to transport very far. You can kind of think of this as, so here you have soil and sediment, here you have atmosphere, here you have water, here you have some sort of mixture. And you see here's your PCBs. PCBs are found all over the globe, so are dioxins, but the heavier ones don't go as far. So you can sort of look at this as you go up this way, you increase the potential for long-range transport of these molecules, okay? The molecule, the test case molecule for perfluorochemicals is perfluorooctane sulfonate. Here it is right here. It's an 8-carbon chain that's fully fluorinated and sulfonate group out here. This molecule doesn't fit on this graph. You can't get a KOW for perfluorochemicals. They form their own phase. So normally what you do is you take a beaker that's got water and octanol in it. The octanol floats on the top, the water's underneath. You put your molecule in there and you measure both phases, and now you know your octanol water partition coefficient. If you put perfluorochemicals in there, now all of a sudden instead of 2 layers, you've got 3 layers. It's not measurable, okay? In fact, these things don't go into the fat of organisms, they bind to proteins, albumin in blood, enterohepatic cycling of enzymes, those kinds of things. So KOW is out the window, we can't really think of that. Air-water partition coefficient, the Henry's law constant, Don Mackay, Frank's advisor, said, well, let's measure these molecules. He models these things based on their physical chemical parameters. Took perfluorochemicals, dissolved them in a beaker of water, put it in a hood, boiled the water for a week or a month, left it sit there. The perfluorochemicals didn't go anywhere. They stayed in the dissolve phase. These things, despite the fact that fluorine tends to give compounds wings, makes them more volatile, this the pKa of this is less than 0. There's no group out here that wants to stay on that negative end. And in fact, fluorine is so electronegative that the entire surface of this molecule is negatively charged. The positive charge is actually in the carbon chain on the interior of it. So this is almost like a little negatively charged particle in the environment. It's not going to go in the atmosphere. It's not going to go anywhere. It's going to stick to stuff and stay put. Okay, great. We've got a molecule we don't have to worry about, right? Well, it turns out that's not quite the case, because if you look at, in this case, this was from aquatic mammals and birds from around the globe that were found dead. That just happened to be how they collected them. I don't think perfluorochemicals killed them. You found perfluorochemicals, in particular PFOS, in animals and birds from around the globe. 3M made PFOS, and when they started looking at this, they were interested in their workers' blood, because they knew they were being exposed to it because they're manufacturing it. Well, anytime you do a study, you have to have good quality assurance, quality control. So they went and they said, we need to find blanks so that we can measure it. So they went to the American Red Cross blood supply, grabbed some blood. Oh, they found perfluorochemicals. I went, okay, let's raise some rabbits. Let's find some rabbits. We'll take their blood. We'll use that. Nope, perfluorochemicals there. Okay, let's go to Asia. They went all over the globe. They found perfluorochemicals everywhere. Okay, here's a molecule that I just told you shouldn't go anywhere, and they're finding it everywhere. All right. The interesting thing that happened here is, and I'll take you one back one. This is just a cartoon of the chemical structure. In fact, PFOS was often called chemical rebar. On the persistent side of the equation that Bill was talking about, persistent, bioaccumulative, toxic, persistence, we're way off the charts. You can take this molecule, boil it in nitric acid, and it doesn't break down. It's extremely, extremely recalcitrant. When you get PFOS, it's there forever. Okay, so global transportation, global distribution, if we find it all over the globe, it had to get there through the atmosphere. Now, Frank corrected me when I was emailing him last week and said, no, you got to think, water moves all over the globe too. Yeah, but it doesn't move to the interior of North America, and it certainly doesn't move to small lakes and Voyageurs National Park where we found this molecule. So we know it's getting there from the atmosphere. But we know that PFOS isn't going to be in the atmosphere. We know that these acids, perfluorinated acids, are not going to be in the atmosphere. But it turns out other molecules, fluorotelmer alcohols produced by DuPont, are volatile, and they can undergo global transportation. The end products that were used for perfluorochemicals that were on your carpet, on your clothing, as stain protectants, on your McDonald's food wrappers, what was actually attached were sulfonylurethanol. So just like that PFOS molecule, but an aminoethanol group that was attached then to your surface. That can cleave off and can be volatile. We know it breaks down because you have to reapply this stuff as a stain protectant. So it's going somewhere, all right? The other thing is the sulfonyl fluoride. So PFOS and the acids can go directly into the water, but to get all over the world, we have to get in the atmosphere. And these things can get in the atmosphere. And then they undergo reactions in the atmosphere that then make them globally distributed. So we showed, in the case of sulfonylurethanol ethanols, Scott Mabry's group in Toronto showed that shorter chain sulfonylurethanol will break down to some extent to the sulfonate. In my lab, we took the manufacturing intermediate, the sulfonyl fluoride. So instead of, let's see if I can go back here. So instead of this oxygen out here, there's a fluorine out here. This molecule is extremely volatile. Okay? And in talking with my colleagues at 3M that weren't in the environmental division, that were in the toxicology division, they know that's how the workers were being exposed to this molecule. So we took this molecule, put it in an artificial atmosphere with a droplet of water, and we created PFOS in an artificial atmosphere. So when I went back to 3M, I said, look, I think this is maybe how everything got everywhere, is your manufacturing intermediate, which is extremely volatile. All it has to do is volatilize from the manufacturing process, get all over the globe, find water, it becomes PFOS. And they said, no, you don't understand. We were trying to make money from this. We would never have lost anything, which was the moment I knew I was right. So in this case, it wasn't the end product. It wasn't. So if I came to you as a chemical manufacturer and said, this is a molecule, if people would have come to me with this molecule, I said, yeah, that's a great molecule. It's not going to go anywhere. Yeah, it's persistent as all get out. Okay, it may have some toxicological endpoints, but it's really not going to go anywhere. It may not have, but other molecules did that became it, both in the manufacture of it and in the breakdown from other products. And so now we're not just talking about chemicals made for industry, we're talking about either their reaction products or their intermediates in manufacturing that can also be an issue that you have to take into account when you start producing chemicals. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ron.
Am I good? So, now for something, mind if I think? Now for something completely different. Okay. So, I don't have a chemical structure on these slides. Now, I did really enjoy sitting here listening to Bill and Matt because it made me feel like I was back in pharmacy school because all those compounds look exactly like pharmaceuticals to some degree. But we're going to talk about something different. So let me tell you a little bit about Lowell Anderson and myself. We both have pharmacy degrees. And so we come from this my meds, my environment from a pharmacy perspective, practice perspective. I did my graduate work at focusing on healthcare policy, economics, drug regulation, that sort of thing. And that's sort of where my interest is. Lowell is a practitioner, actually from Minnesota, nationally and internationally recognized and has worked a lot with the Federation of International Pharmacy, working on issues of pharmaceuticals in the environment. So that's sort of our background. Whoops. I can't do that slide. This comes from the International Federation of Pharmacy. As pharmacists, we're responsible for medication use process, and as we think about that, when we educate pharmacists to be pharmacy practitioners, we focus a lot on what the compound looks like, how biological or how its manufacturing process, how it's formulated, how it's used within the system, how it's metabolized within the system, and what proportions of that molecule or that product are excreted via feces, urine, sweat, respiration. That's about where our responsibilities end when it comes to education. We want to make sure you take your medication appropriately, that the outcomes, whatever that medication is expected to do, does so, and so we're worried about your compliance and making sure that you understand your medication and take it from a professional perspective. That's it. But I think we all recognize, at least Lowell and I recognize, that there are downstream consequences of you being compliant with your medication, because much of what you take in gets excreted either as an active form or a metabolite that is also biologically active. So that's the pharmacy piece that's the piece on pharmacy and why we're sort of thinking about this from an environmental perspective. The pharmaceutical process is pretty complex. We have research, we have manufacturing process, we have wholesalers to get in line with the distribution. We have pharmacy benefit managers. We can touch on those later. Those are people who sort of decide what your physician is going to prescribe. We have the prescriber. We have pharmacists that dispense. We have pharmacists who are concerned about how you take your medication, whether it's appropriate or not. Eventually, all that ends up to the patient and the consumer. And we recognize that there's a lot of externalities associated with this whole process. Some of those externalities are positive. You get vaccinated and somebody else benefits that didn't get vaccinated because you increased the herd immunity. And so that's a society benefits because you got immunized. But there's some negative consequences of externalities, and we think that one of the negative consequences of pharmaceutical use and compliance is what happens with those active ingredients that end up, those active agents that end up in our groundwater and water supply. I don't think I need to tell you that we have feminized fish, and we have Prozac everywhere, and we have antibiotics in all our water systems. And so we know that we could think about externalities in the way we do other industries, and we say, well, okay, you're causing this harm and you're going to have to pay for cleanup. So we tax or levy. I think most of us, at least Lowell and I, have been around long enough to know that if we try to do that with the pharmaceutical industry, that's going nowhere. There is at least one pharmaceutical lobbyist for every legislator in Washington. So they trying to do this legislatively probably will. So, but there are externalities associated with this. This sort of irreverent slide comes from Finland. Some of you may have seen that. And so on the left-hand side of this is where all the effort is, right? All the effort has really been placed on the left-hand side of this, how we dispose of medications, right? And so the Joint Accreditation for Hospitals, JCAHO, has policies in terms of how hospitals dispose of their pharmaceutical waste, and how that gets done, whether it's incinerated or not. Long-term care nursing homes have regulations in terms of how they dispose of unused medications in long-term care facilities. That's regulated. You must have been under a rock if you haven't heard about pharmacy take-back programs. You can take your unused drugs to somewhere and somebody will dispose of them. We have a lot, and we work really diligently, I think, on this left-hand side, okay? Lowell and I are concerned about the right-hand side. What happens when we take our medications appropriately. One of my colleagues on the other side of, on the Twin Cities side, Minneapolis side, Steve Schoenemeyer, has done some estimates, and we think that about 10 or 15% of all medications dispensed, sold, however you want to think about it, in the United States are here, okay? So that means about 85 or 90% of people take their medications that are dispensed to them. We've tried to find out what proportion of what you take ends up being excreted predominantly in the urine as an active ingredient or unchanged. And that's really hard to quantify because it ranges from about 90% to maybe about 30%, depending on the compound and dose, etc. So as a conservative estimate, we're using 50%. But about 50% of what is consumed as an active ingredient ends up as an active or a metabolite it gets excreted. If that's the case, then about what contributes here on the right-hand side is 3 to 4 times what is contributed by throwing it down the drain. Okay, so 75–80% of the pharmaceuticals we find in wastewater and groundwater and doesn't get cleared by our water treatment facilities is because of us, what we do. So if we can't make sure we can't tax it, what do we do about it? We can't legislate this, what do we do about it? I think Bill mentioned the fact that some pharmaceuticals are necessary, and so how do we, you should take your medication, but which medication should you take? And so we're thinking that, that if we inform people, knowledge is power, and if we inform people and inform prescribers, they may make different decisions if they know the consequences of either their consumption or the prescribing. And so the Swedes have been a little bit ahead of us. I think they started in 2004. And they've looked within the Stockholm County, worked with the Pharmacist Society in Sweden, and classified pharmaceuticals in terms of their contribution to risk to the water environments in Sweden. And they publish this every other year. And it is about 300 to 400 of the most often used pharmaceuticals in the county of Stockholm. And so we're going to get back to the persistence, toxicity, and bioaccumulation because that's exactly how they classify pharmaceuticals. They identify them in terms of their risk in the aquatic environment, and then they mash that together with the amount of medications that are dispensed in Sweden. Our idea then is to take the same concept and apply it to Minnesota and try to think about how we can, if we can inform patients, consumers, those people who make formulary decisions with regard to their contributions to the environment from pharmaceuticals, that might actually do something to affect pharmaceuticals in our environment. The pharmaceuticals in our environment are not going to get any less if we don't do anything, because we are all aging. I'm a good example of that. And as we age, we take more medications. As we take more medications, we simply continue to contribute to our water environment. And I think I'm trying to get back a little bit.
Thanks, Ron. And I'll note this, not the Swedes, but the Swiss are taking another tack. They've decided to upgrade all their wastewater infrastructure to try and take out the pharmaceuticals at the tail end of the system as well. So that's another possibility, but it costs a lot of money. So the question then becomes, what can we do? And this becomes somewhat of a philosophical discussion that we'd like to continue with you here in a moment. So these were just our kind of general thought here. You know, chemicals are necessary and helpful, right? We're not going to get rid of them. We need to use them. But what often makes them good for industry makes them bad for the environment, right? Things that make them persistent or biologically active, those are things we might need them to be, but once they aren't in their target environment anymore, those same properties are not good. We have to remember that they don't stay put, right? Chemicals are going to go places we don't expect. And that their chemical structure is going to drive that. And so maybe that's a tool we can use to predict that. The other thing is they're going to become other things, and we need to know what happens there. And there's a great example from a group at University of Iowa and University of Alberta recently. They were looking at a hormone given to cows, and they showed that when it shined light on it, it went away very quickly. So if it got into the environment in the sun, it would go away. And when the FDA approved the use of this compound, they saw the same thing, right? The manufacturer did. And they got the idea. They said, what happens if we turn off the light? So they watched it go away. They turned off the light.
No.
And it came back. And they went to the FDA and said, hey, the chemical you've approved comes back. They went, huh, I don't know what to do about that. And so the testing has to be robust. Right? We have to remember that these biological effects, and it's going to depend on the dose, it's going to depend on the organism, what might be toxic to one organism might not be toxic to another. And the other thing we have to remember is chemical regulation is outdated. A lot of it was written in the 70s and 80s and hasn't been upgraded since. Frank Lautenberg, the senator from New Jersey, was really into this, and then of course he passed away, and that was the end of that for the time being. So what do we need to do? We need to predict where chemicals are going to go. We need to do thorough toxicity testing. Neither of these things is cheap, right? And it prevents the chemical from getting to market, so that we push back on that. We can potentially use computational things. EPA is very into computational toxicology right now, trying to do all this in a computer without the animal testing or the like. And then there's changing laws, changing regulations, new partnerships. And another big piece of this is public education. Well, if the consumer's informed, if the manufacturers are informed, if the academics are all informed, we know the manufacturers know things we certainly don't do. So no. That can help this process along, right? If consumers push back on issues, the suppliers listen, and then the manufacturers need to listen as well. So I want to end by just saying, I didn't steal an image from the internet, but right, this is kind of the people, planet, profit. You can think about the same thing in terms of chemicals and pollutants, right? Chemicals help people. In some cases, they may help the planet. They certainly provide a profit, but there's going to be the negatives on all cases too. If you have chemical contamination, that's going to hurt your bottom line. And Minnesota is a good place to do this, right? We've got a generally environmentally informed citizenry. We've got some companies in town that are environmentally responsible and interested in things like this. And also we've got, by and large, a pretty environmentally informed legislature. So you've kind of got the three pieces there where you can do some good if everyone starts talking to each other. So with that, I'll invite Matt and Ron up, and we can sit down and have a discussion here. So we've got a project over in civil environmental geoengineering right now that's kind of looking at, we're calling it a wastewater think tank, trying to figure out what Minnesota should do going forward. Switzerland's really taking the lead on this. Other places in Europe may follow. And it will kind of depend on how it works out, I think. I mean, they did an economic analysis where they basically asked people, how much are you willing to pay for this? And they basically said $100 a year. And then they figured out all the upgrades were only going to cost $75 a year, so they figured out, they're good in that respect. But the question is, there's an energy cost with that as well, so there are other issues. And there's some arguments from the other side that maybe we shouldn't be putting our efforts here, but to other environmental things. So I think Switzerland is the case study. I'll start, you guys can jump in. So the first thing here is, I have an allergy sufferer, so I take my medications all the time too. Take your medications. And I'm not saying that I'm not that kind of doctor or pharmacist. I think with this, sometimes you're a little better off, because if you can show that there's a direct impact on human health and it's not so esoteric as sometimes climate changes to people. So the great example is just over in the Como neighborhood. They just did a reevaluation of the trichloroethylene plume that was there and realized there was vapor intrusion coming out of those houses. If it's affecting you personally or locally, people are much more active, and that breakthrough is much easier. And I mean, we're having that same issue. There's still Superfund sites that haven't been cleaned up. And if there's a potential impact there, people want it changed. Medication gets a little bit harder because you have to show that there's some impact, but when they were showing the fish being feminized in Colorado, people have a connection to their local river and fishing there, and so they want that fixed. Whereas you have more of the tragedy of the commons issue with climate change in some respects.
Yeah, I would say that the climate change is actually an easy one, because there are solutions that are relatively easy to deal with. When you get to environmental chemicals, depends on the chemical, depends on the system, it depends on the area that you're in. Bill and I are actually trying to figure out a way to remove perfluorochemicals from groundwater. 3 other groups are being funded by the same agency to destroy them. I don't think they're going to be successful, but if they are, great. So there are people working on that to try to do it. But the issue becomes more in the fact that when you go back to think about the reason we're studying these processes and these chemicals is to then prevent the next chemical down the line from getting out there and doing the same thing. That's sort of where we're putting a lot of our effort. Or in the case of triclosan, telling people that you didn't need it in the first place. There was the study, it was funded by Procter & Gamble. They did it all around the world to initiate hand washing, and they had triclosan versus, or actually I think that was triclocarban.
Maybe.
One of their antibacterial soaps, and it turned out it didn't matter whether it had antibacterial in it or not, just the fact of hand washing reduced or improved health. And so education in those kinds of things, I think, are valuable, and people will understand that it's an issue. What becomes more difficult, and what I think may get to the crux of your problem, is when we try and communicate risk to people. The biggest problem we have is communicating uncertainty in that risk, and still being able to act on the information we have, given both the risk and the uncertainty in that risk. That's where, as a public health professional, I see the biggest challenge is actually in communicating that risk to the general public, and more importantly, the uncertainty in that risk.
My colleague Lowell Anderson says as soon as we find out that we're feminizing walleyes instead of smallmouth, there's going to be a lot of people in Minnesota be more concerned. I have a lot of colleagues who are very concerned about the way I'm thinking, or the way Lowell and I are thinking. We're thinking about this from a pharmaceutical perspective, because they spend most of their clinical lives as clinicians making sure people appropriately take their medications. And so I was talking to a colleague recently, and I asked him, I said, well, then you would prefer that we keep everybody in the dark and not give them this information because ignorance is bliss. And so I think we have a responsibility to let people know what we know. But not all of these pharmaceuticals are terribly harmful. And so you think about antibiotics and neoplastic agents and hormonal agents, and oftentimes there's a therapeutic alternative, but people just don't know what that therapeutic alternative is. And so if you think about the alternative, then you can make informed choices, and I think that's what that's one of the things that really has to be. It's not just giving people information, but helping them in the process of making informed decisions. The other thing I wanted to say with regard to treatment or water treatments, not everybody is exposed at the same level. If you're in Minneapolis, St. Paul, you may be exposed to pharmaceutical waste at a higher degree than if you're in Bemidji, simply because of population and utilization. But also within the city, there are places where pharmaceutical waste is much higher. Say cancer treatment centers, where the effluent out of hospitals or cancer treatment centers may be more toxic than out of your general neighborhood. And so there's a way of thinking about treatment at that upstream level before water treatment that may in fact be useful. I shouldn't say absolutely yes you can, but there are alternatives. And so let me just say one thing that's sort of been noodling around in some of our minds is that a few years ago we were very concerned about pharmacotherapy for orphan diseases, right? And so there was some legislation passed to encourage pharmaceutical companies to look at treatment options for orphan diseases, and the reason they wouldn't do that is because of money. There's only a couple 100,000 people, we're not going to waste the research dollars. But if I have an incentive like exclusivity, I could do that. Well, we might want to think about this same thing with regard to pharmaceuticals, that there is some exclusivity or opportunity for pharmaceutical firms that can find ways of targeting medications better. So there isn't, rather than throwing the entire dose at you, we can target that medication more specifically. And if you think about cancer chemotherapy right now, there's a lot of effort on targeting drugs to solid tumors, which then you would think would have less overall exposure, both from a side effect perspective, but also elimination. So I think there are ways of thinking about that.
I just want to follow up on that. One of the things that you may have missed that Ron said, that 50% is the parent compound and metabolites. So some of that is already metabolized through you, and what ends up happening in the wastewater treatment plant is when you metabolize it, you conjugate it, you basically stick another molecule part on there. What the wastewater treatment bugs do is deconjugate it back to the parent product. And so even though you're eliminating it as a metabolite, it becomes then the parent product after it goes through the wastewater treatment plant, which is a whole other issue with wastewater treatment that has to be addressed.
That's absolutely true. There's some really pretty good literature out there that demonstrates that that's exactly what
I think it might influence the implications more of our work, but I think, speaking for me, my colleagues are doing some of the similar research, trying to study processes and things like that. But to get to your point of Europe having a precautionary principle, and in one case they banned anything chlorinated, which I thought was a great idea. They also have an industry standard called REACH, which is extremely restrictive. And this is one case where globalization is actually having a positive impact. When I talk to my colleagues at 3M, all they talk about is REACH, because they have to obey those laws in Europe, and if they're doing it there, it's easier for them to have one system, excuse me, one system than have several systems. And this is one case where legislation there is actually having impacts globally for global companies.
Unless these large negotiated trade pacts change everything, right? So I was going to say, none of us are in the chemistry department who would be better answer that question.
That's where I was going with the chemistry department. So when I started graduate school, one of my best friends who now works as an environmental chemist for 3M, when he went to the chemistry department, says, I want to do environmental chemistry. And they told him there's no such thing. Then 15 years later, everybody in the chemistry department did environmental chemistry, whether they were doing it or not. So I I think there has been a big shift in chemistry for sure. And that's where it has to take place because they're the ones creating these molecules and things. Just an anecdotal story. I was talking to a colleague from Canada that we were talking about polymorphin and diphenyl ether. He says, well, okay, would you rather have a kid grow up a little with a slower IQ or die in an apartment fire? And he said, that's a bunch of BS. He said, let the organic chemists figure out a new molecule, that's their job. And he was right, so.
I could sort of speak to pharmacists. I can't tell you how many times over the last 10 years I've had a student, because we require a PharmD paper, research paper upon graduation, that have come into me and they've been working with either somebody over at St. Paul campus or one of these guys working on environmental projects and bring that in. And they're very attuned to environmental, but they're not so attuned to the pharmaceutical piece. And so when I talk to the students, the sort of older students, about what we're thinking, their eyes get big and they go, oh, well, we've never thought about that. Because like I said, our curriculum really focuses on making sure we want to know what happens and where it goes and how it's metabolized, but then we forget about it. And I think within the students that I see and that have approached me after, there's a lot of interest in what is the whole picture of pharmaceutical use, not the little piece that focuses on individuals.
Yeah, well, so Bill showed you a little bit of that just with his Lake Pepin core. So the way lakes clean themselves is they sediment these
Right.
things out and they bury them forever. As long as you don't dredge them up, they're there.
Right.
You can forget about them. And I've done most of my career work on the Great Lakes, and we've seen the same thing. Basically, that's the way the lake cleans themselves is they bury these things. So, in essence, they do go. They're there, but they're out of sight, out of mind, if you will. If they're not biologically bioavailable, then they're not an issue. Having said that, these perfluorochemicals, they're going to be around forever.
Right.
There's just no way of breaking them down. Whether or not they are at a high enough concentration to cause an effect in an area remains to be seen site by site. So it really does depend on where you are and what's going on. But some of these molecules, and we've already created molecules that go away very quickly. The sulfonylureas that are used in agriculture, they last for about a week on the soil and they're gone. Which again came out of this whole, okay, we've got stuff that's so persistent, let's try and make something that's not persistent but still active.
Yeah, I think the short answer is it depends.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It's going to be chemical by chemical. I mean, it's said PCBs were banned however many years ago, but they're still in fish, right? The levels in Lake Michigan have been going down over time, but the half-life is long. And some chemicals, it won't be an issue at all. And there are other cases where it's not the chemical, but it's the environment. So there are cases where the Department of Defense, for example, has contaminated groundwater at a military base. And we know how to destroy the chemical, but we can't get at it because of where it is in the groundwater, what the hydrogeology is.
Well, please join me again in thanking all of our speakers from today.